It is 6:19 p.m. on March 27, 2023. I'm going to resume my reading of V.I. Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, page 96, starting the bottom of page 96. Alongside the colonial possessions of the great powers, we have placed the small colonies of the small states, which are, so to speak, the next objects of a possible and probable redivision of colonies. Most of these small states are able to retain their colonies only because of the conflicting interest, friction, etc., among the big powers, which prevent them from coming to an agreement in regard to the division of the spoils. The semi-colonial states provide an example of the transitional forms which are to be found in all spheres of nature and society. Finance capital is such a great, it may be said, such a decisive force in all economic and in all international relations that it is capable of subjecting and actually does subject to itself even states enjoying the fullest political independence. We shall shortly see examples of this. Of course, finance capital finds most convenient and is able to extract the greatest profit from such a subjection as involves the loss of the political independence of the subjected countries and peoples. In this connection, the semi-colonial countries provide a typical example of the middle stage. It is natural that the struggle for these semi-independent countries should have become particularly bitter in the epoch of finance capital, when the rest of the world has already been divided up. Colonial policy and imperialism existed before the latest stage of capitalism and even before capitalism. Rome, founded on slavery, pursued a colonial policy and practiced imperialism. But general disquisitions on imperialism, which ignore or put into the background the fundamental difference between social economic systems, inevitably degenerate into the most vapid banality or bragging, like the comparison Greater Rome and Greater Britain. Even the capitalist colonies of previous stages of capitalism is essentially different from the colonial policy of finance capital. The principal feature of the latest stage of capitalism is the domination of monopolist combines of the big capitalists. These monopolies are most firmly established when all the sources of raw materials are captured by one group, and we have seen with what zeal the international capitalist combines exert every effort to make it impossible for their rivals to compete with them by buying up, for example, iron ore fields, oil fields, etc. Colonial possession alone gives the monopolies complete guarantee against all contingencies in the struggle with competitors, including the contingency that the latter will defend themselves by means of a law establishing a state monopoly. The more capitalism is developed, the more strongly the shortage of raw materials is felt, the more intense the competition and the hunt for sources of raw materials throughout the whole world, the more desperate is the struggle for the acquisition of colonies. Quote, "It may be asserted," writes Schilder, although it may sound paradoxical to some, that in the more or less discernible future, the growth of the urban and industrial population is more likely to be hindered by a shortage of raw materials for industry than by a shortage of food, end quote. For example, there is a growing shortage of timber, the price of which is steadily rising, of leather, and of raw materials for the textile industry. Quote, "Associations of manufacturers are making efforts to create an equilibrium between agriculture and industry in the whole of world economy. As an example of this, we might mention the International Federation of Cotton Spinners Associations in several of the most important industrial countries, founded in 1904, and the European Federation of Flax Spinners Associations, founded on the same model in 1910, end quote. The bourgeois reformists, and among them particularly the present-day adherents of Kautsky, of course, try to belittle the importance of facts of this kind by arguing that it would be possible to obtain raw materials in the open market without a costly and dangerous colonial policy, and that it would be possible to increase the supply of raw materials to an enormous extent simply by improving conditions in agriculture in general. But such arguments become an apology for imperialism, an attempt to embellish it, because they ignore the principal feature of the latest stage of capitalism, monopolies. Free markets are becoming more and more a thing of the past. Monopolist syndicates and trusts are restricting them more and more every day, and simply improving conditions in agriculture means improving the conditions of the masses, raising wages, and reducing profits. Where, except in the imagination of sentimental reformists, are there any trusts capable of interesting themselves in the condition of the masses instead of the conquest of colonies? Finance capital is interested not only in the already discovered sources of raw materials, but also in potential sources, because present-day technical development is extremely rapid, and land which is useless today may be made fertile tomorrow if new methods are applied. To devise these new methods, a big bank can equip a special expedition of engineers, agricultural experts, etc. And if large amounts of capital are invested, this also applies to prospecting for minerals, to new methods of working up and utilizing raw materials, etc., etc. Hence, the inevitable striving of finance capital to enlarge its economic territory and even its territory in general. In the same way that the trusts capitalize their property at 2 or 3 times its value, taking into account its potential and not present profits, the further results of monopoly, so finance capital strives in general to seize the largest possible amount of land of all kinds in all places, and by every means taking into account potential sources of raw materials, and fearing to be left behind in the fierce struggle of the last scraps of undivided territory, or for the repetition of those that have already been divided. The British capitalists are exerting every effort to develop cotton growing in their colony, Egypt. In 1904, out of 2,300,000 hectares of land under cultivation, 600,000 or more than 1/4 were devoted to cotton growing. The Russians are doing the same in their colony, Turkestan, because in this way they will be in a better position to defeat their foreign competitors, to monopolize the sources of raw materials and form a more economical and profitable textile trust in which all the processes of cotton production and manufacturing will be combined and concentrated in the hands of one set of owners. The interests pursued in exporting capital also give an impetus to the conquest of colonies, for in the colonial market it is easier to employ monopolist methods, and sometimes they are the only methods that can be employed, to eliminate competition, to make sure of contracts, to secure the necessary connections, etc. The non-economic superstructure, which grows up on the basis of finance capital, its politics, and its ideology, stimulates the striving for colonial conquest. Quote, finance capital does not want liberty, it wants domination, as Hilferding very truly says, end quote. And a French bourgeois writer, developing and supplementing, as it were, the ideas of Cecil Rhodes quoted above, writes that social causes should be added to the economic causes of modern colonial policy. Quote, owing to the growing complexities of life and the difficulties which weigh not only on the masses of workers, but also on the middle classes, impatience, irritation, and hatred are accumulating in all the countries of the old civilization and are becoming a menace to public order. The energy which is being hurled out of the definite class channel must be given employment abroad in order to avert an explosion at home. End quote. Since we are speaking of colonial policy in the epoch of capitalist imperialism, it must be observed that finance capital and its corresponding foreign policy, which reduces itself to the struggle of the great powers for the economic and political division of the world, give rise to a number of transitional forms of state dependence. Typical of this epoch is not only the 2 main groups of countries, those owning colonies and colonies, but also the diverse forms of dependent countries which officially are politically independent, but in fact are enmeshed in the net of financial and diplomatic dependence. We have already referred to one form of dependence, the semi-colony. An example of another is provided by Argentina. Quote, South America, and especially Argentina, writes Schulze-Gavenitz in his work on British imperialism, is so dependent financially on London that it ought to be described as almost a British commercial colony, end quote. Basing himself on the report of the Austro-Hungarian Council at Buenos Aires for 1909, Schilder estimates the amount of British capital invested in Argentina at 8,750,000,000 francs. It is not difficult to imagine what strong connections British finance capital and its faithful friend, diplomacy, thereby acquires with the Argentine bourgeoisie, with the circles that control the whole of that country's economic and political life. A somewhat different form of financial and diplomatic dependence, accompanied by political independence, is presented by Portugal. Portugal is an independent sovereign state, but actually, for more than 200 years, since the War of the Spanish Succession of 1701 to 14, it has been a British protectorate. Great Britain has protected Portugal and her colonies in order to fortify her own positions in the fight against her rivals, Spain and France. In return, Great Britain has received commercial privileges, preferential conditions for importing goods, and especially capital into Portugal and the Portuguese colonies, the right to use the ports and islands of Portugal, her telegraph cables, etc. Relations of this kind have always existed between big and little states, but in the epoch of capitalist imperialism, they become a general system. They form part of the sum total of divide the world relations, become links in the chain of operations of world finance capital. In order to finish with the question of the division of the world, we must make the following additional observation. This question was raised quite openly and definitely not only in the American literature after the Spanish-American War and in English literature after the Anglo-Boer War, at the very end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. Not only has German literature, which has most jealously watched British imperialism, systematically given its appraisal of this fact, it has also been raised in French bourgeois literature in terms as wide and definite as they can be made from the bourgeois point of view. We will quote Driol, the historian, who in his book Political and Social Problems at the end of the 19th century, in the chapter The Great Powers and the Division of the World, wrote the following, quote, "During the past few years, all the free territory of the globe, with the exception of China, has been occupied by the powers of Europe and North America. Several conflicts and displacements of influence have already occurred over this matter, which foreshadow more terrible upheavals in the next future. For it is necessary to make haste. The nations which have not yet made provision for themselves run the risk of never receiving their share and never participating in the tremendous exploitation of the globe, which will be one of the most essential features of the next century, i.e. the 20th. That is why all Europe and America have lately been afflicted with the fever of colonial expansion, of imperialism, that most noteworthy feature of the end of the 19th century," end quote. And the author added, quote, "In this partition of the world, in this furious hunt for the treasures and the big markets of the globe, the relative power of the empires founded in this 19th century is totally out of proportion to the place occupied in Europe by the nations which founded them. The dominant powers in Europe, the arbitrators of her destiny, are not equally preponderant in the whole world, and as colonial power, the hope of controlling as yet unassessed wealth will evidently react upon the relative strength of the European powers. The colonial question, imperialism, if you will, which has already modified the political conditions of Europe itself, will modify these more and more." End quote. I will stop at the bottom of page 104.